Hi, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Welcome to today's Courageous Conversation. Today's question comes from Christina, and she wrote in saying, I've been working on healing from complex trauma for almost 10 years. How do you keep going when it seems like it will never be done? Something I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. Thank you, Christina, for sharing this question. Right? I'm sure that a lot of you really can relate to this, whether it's been 10 years or more, or even if it's been 6 months to a year. You put so much into this process. Even just getting to the point where you begin the process takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of energy. And you work at it and you work at it. And there are days that you feel like you were even worse off or are even worse off than you were before you started. I get it. I remember those feelings personally at times, even though I didn't necessarily know that I was working on healing because I didn't think that healing was possible. But I also really understand that from a therapist perspective. I don't know that I've ever worked with anybody for more than maybe a couple of weeks who hasn't struggled with it, who hasn't felt like giving up. And some have actually said, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore, and have backed out. They usually come back in some form or another, but it's really discouraging. It can feel really disheartening and hopeless. So I really appreciate this question because it is something that so many people can relate to, and it really is a part of something that you have to be able to deal with in this process. So what do you do when you feel like you're never actually going to be done? The first thing is remind yourself that healing doesn't mean that you end up at a place at some point in the future where nothing ever bothers you, where you're never unhappy or sad, where you never think about the abuse. So having a clear idea, or relatively clear idea, what healing really is, because I think a lot of times people desire to not struggle anymore. And it can seem that it's very black and white, either or. Either you're really struggling or there's no struggle. And the reality is that life can be hard. Life can throw you a curveball. So healing isn't about never struggling. Healing is about not being affected in the same ways that you're affected now. It means having different ideas about who you are in the world, instead of automatically assuming that you're undeserving of something, or that you're unworthy, or that you'll never find a healthy relationship. Instead of those being your core beliefs, you approach your day-to-day life from a place of, it's okay if I make a mistake. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. If somebody disappoints me, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's personal. It doesn't mean that they don't care. So you approach your days very differently because the ideas, the beliefs that drive you are different. And ultimately, that's really what healing is. It's changing what those core beliefs are. So again, having a much more clear idea, more realistic idea of what healing is. So yes, you get to a point that the abuse doesn't dictate your life. And yes, things will still be hard sometimes. So having that as kind of a foundation when you think about healing or where you're at in the progress or in process is helpful. The other thing is when you find yourself looking at other people, whether it's me or somebody else who you know has been abused, and you look at them and think, oh, they've done the healing and they're great, or they're in this great place, being able to remind yourself that they struggle at times too. I still struggle at times, and for different kinds of reasons and to different degrees. Because again, it's not about never struggling. It's just about not struggling to the degree that you struggled before. So when you find yourself comparing yourself to other people, recognizing that you're only comparing one little piece that you can see, that there may be other things under the surface. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's helpful for people to be able to talk with other people. It doesn't have to be on YouTube, but just talk about healing, talk about struggle in general. So when you're comparing yourself to somebody else, recognize that you're comparing, and that comparison that you're making may not necessarily be a truly accurate representation of where that person is. So that's another piece. Another aspect that is really important is reminding yourself over and over and over again that healing is a process. And part of that necessary process is learning and growing and having some good days. And then when something comes up that causes struggle, recognizing that that's part of the process, not a setback, not a failure, because it's not, it's truly not. Without those points of struggle in this process, you never get the experience of seeing how different you're able to experience it, how differently you navigate that struggle, that you move through it more quickly than you might have in the past. So recognizing that these so-called setbacks, which they are not, and I've done a video on that, it's really part of the necessary process in order to go further down the road. It builds your confidence. It builds your understanding of what you've already been able to do, which is another really important piece of not losing hope. Take time to intentionally reflect on where you were before you started. Granted, you may not be where you want to be. You might still have some really, really tough days or weeks or months. But I'm guessing if you've been doing this for any period of time whatsoever, and you're actually working with somebody in this process, that you can look back before you started and probably identify many ways that you've grown, that you have healed. And sometimes this can be an important role of your therapist or coach or whomever you're working with, because they can see those things much more easily than you can. They can recognize how differently you're showing up in session, because they're not caught up in the struggle that you're caught up in. They're not feeling that intensity of difficulty. They're able to look at it in a more kind of holistic and broad way. So being able to look at where you were and where you are, it may seem like they're really insignificant changes, but they're not. Every time that you do something differently, that is healing. It is. It may not feel like it, especially on those days that you're struggling, but it gets you one step further. Every healing is about many thousands, hundreds of thousands of steps, forward and back. Every single step that you take forward, every moment when you push through a difficult situation, when you take a risk and allow yourself to be vulnerable, when you make a different decision than you would have made before, those are all steps that are leading you up that mountain. Every single one. No bad day, no self-defeating behavior is going to knock you down and take you all the way to the beginning, to the base of that mountain. It's not the way it works. Every step gets you closer. Those days that you are struggling, or those days that you may do something that are self-sabotaging, it may cause you to halt on your hike up that mountain, to take a breather, to take a rest, to reflect on how far you've come. But that's not sending you back to the base. It's just a pause. It's just a recalibration. Another thing that's important is recognizing that healing is an ongoing process, that it takes time, and ultimately it's a lifelong process. For people who do not have an abuse history, they struggle too. They struggle with a lot of the same core beliefs in many ways. Everybody struggles. And when you are feeling disheartened or hopeless about your process, reminding yourself that you are capable of healing. One of the things that we tend to do is look at other people. I was talking about comparison a few moments ago. We tend to look at other people, and even if we're coming from a good place and we're saying to ourselves, okay, she did it, I can too. That little voice in the back of your head will say, yeah, but she's stronger. She's more courageous. She's got more support. She's got a better therapist. There's so many different things, and you know what I'm talking about. There's so many different things that we can say to ourselves that reinforce the idea that somehow there's something about us that is different than all those other people we see. There isn't. There isn't. The only potential difference is that maybe they're further along in the process. But there's room at the top of that summit for all of us. For all of us. And those of us who are kind of on the other side, and there's never, 100% complete in that process, but for those of us who have been on this journey for quite some time, there's nothing that is different in terms of capacity, ability, worthiness, or deserving to heal. Nothing. I don't care what the rebuttal is that you come up with, the yeah, but. It's just an idea that you have about who you are. It's just a way for you to keep yourself separate, to reinforce an idea that you're not capable or worthy. And it's just not true. You are capable. So when you're having those difficult days, reminding yourself that it is possible. Just ask yourself, is it possible that I could get there too? You don't have to come up with how it can happen or why it can happen or why you're deserving of it. Just, is it possible that I could get there too? The answer is always going to be yes, because almost anything is possible. Whether you see the path or not, it's there. and it exists for you. You are capable. You are worthy. Please don't give up. Another thing that I want to say is, Katrina wrote that she's been on this journey for almost 10 years. I do think, it's difficult to find somebody that you feel really comfortable working with. I do think that sometimes, especially if you haven't had a lot of experience with therapists, I do think that sometimes it can be helpful to switch things up a little bit. Maybe work with somebody else for a period of time. It doesn't mean that the person that you're currently working with isn't okay or good or anything like that. But sometimes it can be really helpful just to get another perspective, just to have the experience of how somebody else might work or talk about something. One of the things that I hear often from people is through these videos is that sometimes they'll hear me talk about something that really resonates for them, that they feel like they're hearing it for the first time. Well, as a therapist, I feel pretty confident in saying this, that for many of those people, maybe not all of them, but I really strongly suspect that for some of those people that say, I've never thought of it in that way. I've never heard somebody talk about it in that way. For some of those people, if they've had a good therapist, a therapist who understands childhood sexual abuse, they likely have heard things spoken in a similar way. But maybe because of that relationship, because they've been working with that person for a long time, because they don't really resonate with that person, whatever it might be, that maybe they weren't able to really take it in. It could be as simple as that. So sometimes meeting with another person can be helpful. Maybe you switch permanently, or maybe you just say, you know what? Maybe I want to see if there's somebody else out there that might be a better fit. You get to decide that. Please don't worry about hurting your therapist's feelings. You have to take care of you, and sometimes switching things up is necessary. Please don't ever stay with a therapist because you feel an obligation or because you're afraid of hurting his or her feelings. I know as a therapist, I would never want that. I would want my client to get whatever support or help that they needed that would be beneficial to them. And I think that most therapists would feel similarly. So I think I've covered all the bases that I wanted to cover. Please, if you have a question, send it to Q&A at courageousjourneys.com, and I will look forward to answering more questions in the coming months and years, or however long I'm going to be doing this. I really appreciate both the people who send in the questions, and I've gotten quite a few, and they're really incredible questions, and really looking forward to answering them. And I also want to thank those of you watching who like, who share, who comment, who ask further questions. This really is about creating a bigger conversation. It's about answering Katarina's question, of course, but the idea is that for those of you who can relate or don't understand or have questions about it, that you engage too, that we actually have conversations. Conversations is how we change, which is part of the reason that we cannot heal on our own. We need to have conversations with people who understand. We need to have conversations with people who can reflect back to us what is true. So I welcome questions, comments, rebuttals. If there's something that you don't necessarily agree with or doesn't make sense to you, please share it. You can share it in the comments. If you're watching this on YouTube, share it here. If you're watching this on social media, you can comment there as well. But if somebody has shared this, I may not necessarily know that you're commenting, so it might be better to do it on YouTube. But please, if you know anybody who might benefit from this question, this conversation, this video, I would encourage you to please consider sharing. I will look forward to seeing you next time. Have a beautiful day.